Hi, I'm Margarita Quihuis, and I direct the Peace Innovation Institute. And I'm kicking off this YouTube channel for Peace Innovation with Mark Nelson, the founder of the Peace Innovation Lab at Stanford. We are doing this in the beginning of the second quarter of the COVID pandemic of 2020. Mark, I wanted to start this series by having a conversation with you about our origin stories. You've had a very picaresque background, shall we say. You were born in Canada, but spent significant time of your life in the developing South and the global South. And then as a young adult, you dealt with the famine in Sudan and Ethiopia. And I know that those experiences were formative for you. And then you went into investment banking and so on. But why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got here and how you got to peace?
How I got to peace was by accident. This is one of those synchronicity kind of failures that happens in science occasionally. It's one of the delightful things about science and research is that you think you're doing one thing and the thing you're doing fails sometimes miserably and sometimes for years repeatedly. But in the process of failing at one thing, you trip over something else that turns out to be fascinating. Growing up in the developing world, I was profoundly aware of strong social and relational and cultural capital that I felt so privileged to be invited into in the host countries that I lived in as a child. So I focused in on, poverty is huge, so I focused in specifically on rural poverty, which was the most intractable kind in the 80s and 90s. And then, that's still too big a problem for any one person to dig into, and so chopped off a little piece of that, which is a fairly intractable bit of it, one of the hardest parts, which is called rural to urban capital drain. And it's basically the phenomena where if you put a dollar into a big city, you get a lot of work out of that dollar before it goes somewhere else in the next few weeks. And so, more or less $12 worth of work as you spend your dollar at the grocery store, they pay their employee's salary, the employee pays his rent, the landlord of his building hires a plumber, the plumber buys more groceries, etc. The money goes around in a city. You go to a smaller city, you get about $8 worth of work. You go to a small town, you get maybe $3 or $4 of work. You go to a little village or a little town, you get maybe $2 worth of work out of that dollar before it goes somewhere else. And if you go to the rural countryside around that tiny village where there's really intractable rural poverty, that dollar never touches the ground. You can't get it to stick there. You can't get it to do any work there. And that's the problem I was working on. I tried all sorts of things in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, in Washington State, in the rural parts of Washington, in the middle of the meth epidemic up there. Long story short, nothing worked well enough to scale. And sort of long story shorter yet, in the process, while I was busy trying to solve that problem, most of the rural poor moved to cities anyways. And so in some ways, in 2007, we became a primarily urban species, and that trend is still continuing up. And it turns out that probably the best solution if you're rural poor is to move to a city. That probably is the best solution. Health and life expectancy and a whole bunch of other happiness, a whole bunch of other things go up if you move to a city. Who knew? In the process of failing yet again at something that would actually make a dent in rural to urban capital drain, we discovered a new way to measure peace. And passively in the background, in real time, using technology, using other people's technology, and just being able to ride our measurement and instrumentation on top of that. When we did the postmortem on that failed experiment, I sort of wrote up the one pager and said, well, yet again, we banged our head on a wall on this one, but if somebody's looking for a new way to measure peace, we might be onto something. That's how I got to peace.
So you and I met in 2007 through LinkedIn, and I still have that LinkedIn message saved because I don't throw anything away. And I could probably pull it up, and if we ever write a history of the Peace Innovation Lab, we can throw it in there as an artifact, like the first episode of engagement, shall we say. And I remember that we met on Stanford Avenue, at the Starbucks there, and I live close to campus. So I rode my bike over to meet this guy who reached out to me on LinkedIn who was going to be in the area. I was a former venture capitalist. And when people ask me what I did all day long, I said, basically, I meet people for breakfast. I meet people for coffee. I meet people for lunch. I meet people for afternoon coffee. And then I might meet them for dinner. So venture capitalists do a lot of meetings with people because part of what we're doing is we have this external orientation to discover entrepreneurs and ideas and weak signals and where things are going and what is someone working on that hasn't become a big thing yet. So we're always scouting, looking over the horizon for interesting people, interesting ideas, interesting efforts. Now, I remember the meeting. I have to say, I honestly don't remember what you said. But I remember taking the meeting.
And I think we should really check the date, because I think I actually reached out to you near the end of 2006 on LinkedIn, and then because I was preparing to come to the Valley, and then when I got to the Valley in 2007, I followed up and met you in person, I think. But I reached out to you. I remember vividly where I was in Silver Creek in Washington, in East Lewis County in Washington, when I saw your profile on LinkedIn. LinkedIn had just become a thing. It was just getting started. And you build yourself as a mentor capitalist. And something just about that turn of phrase, mentor capitalist. And I thought, that's somebody I like to know, because I saw the proactive, positive intent in that right from the get-go. And A, your bio was impressive, and B, I'm always looking for people who are preemptively, proactively positive about that outward, outreaching perspective, as you were mentioning. That meeting on Stanford Avenue made an impression on me. I was like, okay, she's as smart as I thought.
I spent a lot of time in so I came to Silicon Valley in 1979. So when I came to do my undergraduate at Stanford when I was 17. So you can figure out my age from that. So I've been in Silicon Valley for 41 years. Yeesh. And I fell into a group of people. There's like, in Palo Alto back then, it's still, so 1979, it still had remnants of the 60s there. So we had Peninsula Free University, and we had the dead houses, and it wasn't the upscale Palo Alto that it is today. It was still, there's still
houses, as in Grateful Dead. You have to just sort of.
Yeah. So so there was still some crunchy granola, not like Berkeley, but still kind of crunchy, right?
Still some hippies in their t-shirts. Yeah,
there's still some hippies, and those hippies were getting into technology, and so they were experimenting with making their own computers. And my mentor Fritz was a member of the Homebrew Club, and the Homebrew Club is known in computer history as the place where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak presented the Apple computer for the first time. And the Homebrew Club was just a bunch of hobbyists who were playing around with electronics, these proto computers, right? The early Ur computers. They didn't even have a screen. I remember using a computer in high school because I was into computers in high school, and it was really more like a teleprompter. It was a keyboard, and it was paper, and I would be doing searches for scholarships, and I would be typing these commands, and with a dot print matrix printer, it would print out the results, right? So there wasn't even
yeah, exactly.
And there wasn't even a screen. And then in the early 80s, you started getting computers with screens and like word processing machines, and that was like a dedicated use of replacing a typewriter with a screen where you could type papers. And actually, that's how I paid for a lot of my schooling. Was I was a word processor. I would type people's PhD dissertations on a Z100, a Z80 computer. So Zenith was making computers back then, and they were using an operating system that I think was called, it was either ZDOS or CP/M. I can't remember which one. And my roommate had the computer, and he let me borrow it to type these dissertations, and I did it in a language called Emacs. Back in the days when you had to when you wrote a program and it had to fit into 32K of memory. So that's all you had to work with.
Yeah.
But again, no analytics, no data that you could pull out of it. It was just, I could create a file in DOS, and there it was, and it was a little text file, and that was my word processing document. Or I could create a little tiny spreadsheet, but it was
kind of all that data was either hex or text. You know, it's like, depending on how you parsed it, it was one of those two things. There was no and no kind of data visualization, no kind of visual output of any kind other than text.
And there wasn't any thinking of computers as a mediating technology between individuals.
Right.
It was really about computation.
Right. This was pre-network, so it was entirely about doing the grunt work that you didn't want to do for your stuff that you were doing. It wasn't about helping you work with other people. That was it was helping you be a better you.
Right. It was automating a manual process is what it was. And even when I did computer-aided design in the 80s, this was back in the days when there were draftsmen with triangles and levels and pencils and electric erasers, because you would want to erase the line, and you were working on vellum, and you would put it through this machine. It had ammonia, and you had a hood because of the fumes and the whole thing. And I was there through the transition from manual drawing and mechanical drawings and blueprints to doing it on the computer, and we did it on a 13-inch screen. Very small.
There's a really good point here. It's sort of layers of the computational history archaeology here. Because if you go back a few years, if you go back into the 60s, everything was networked. Because processors were so expensive that the only kind of computers were mainframes. And so you had dumb terminals. And the dumb terminals engaged with the file on the central mainframe. And so you had early hints and clues of what networking could be, but it was more about sharing computation power or giving access from dumb terminals to computation power, to processor power. And you saw just a few glimmers there of what a network could lead to. And then, from the late 70s, early 80s was the personal computer era that you were talking about, where people were just so glad to have one of these things on their own desktop that they were like, leave me alone while I figure out all the cool things that I can do with this. And then you sort of see the loop back again, or the spiral up to, well, now if we network these things together, even though they each have some distributed processing power, what could we do with that? So you invited me to a Latino network event for
Hispanic Net.
Hispanic Net, thank you, event at Fenwick and West, at the big law firm there in the Valley. That was when the lights really went on for me, because I saw you get a room full of not just entrepreneurs, but a room full of Latin entrepreneurs that are less likely to easily coordinate, especially with guidance from a woman. And I saw you get them to do amazing stuff in an hour. I saw you literally sort of embodying the kind of stuff you were talking about with your programmers, about super agile things, and the whole room coordinating their activity with each other to get things done at a speed that they never imagined they could do. And I had never seen anybody get a group of people to get so much done so quickly. And that was when I was blown away by your talents. And I was like, okay.
Well, that was a fun night, because what we did, the format for Hispanic Net was, I kind of did it like a show. And with the show, what I did was I had people come up and say, okay, this is the competition. We're going to come up with a concept for a startup, right? Yeah. And so you're going to come up with an idea, and then you're going to pitch it. And that's what it was. It was just like prototyping the idea and giving them like some starter. And it was fun, because I go, okay, you got to really go through the whole thing of what it's going to be and what it's going to do and how you're going to sell it, the whole thing. And it was sort of like these lightning rounds. But I do remember that night quite well.
You had actually organized a photographer to give profile photos to help them to make a fancy deck. And because part of what you were doing was, in the early days where pitch training was still a thing, because most people didn't know how to do it. For me, that was the moment of, I could learn a ton from you, and how do I find ways to engage and actually work with you at some point? That was when the lights went on for me. I had never seen a leadership ability like that, to instantly get a whole group of people to just self-organized to make you happy, to get stuff done that then within half an hour, they were making themselves super happy as well. And the key thing was they were making so much progress so quickly because you got them to work together, you know?
Well, but most of it, Mark, quite honestly, was the power of a format, of a recipe.
Absolutely.
And for a lot of people, they didn't know how to do it. And so I said, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3. Here are the ingredients we would do. You mix it, you crack the eggs, mix it up, put it in the oven, boom, done. And just revealing that recipe to people and say, that's all you have to do, mimic that. And I remember having the photographer there because we were struggling to get more diversity on LinkedIn. And I said, okay, and I used to give talks like, okay, you need to get on LinkedIn and this is why. And you can't just show up with your name, no photo, and like date 1, date 2, and the name of your company. There's got to be, you got to be discoverable, you know how. And back then we didn't have the language of SEO quite that yet. Like when I was giving these talks in 2004, 2005, because again we didn't have analytics the way we do now. And I thought, okay, you don't have a headshot. A la BJ, before I met BJ, how do I make it easy? So out of the Hispanic Net budget, I said, how much is it for a photographer? It was like $100. And I go, everybody line up, put your dress shirt on. We're going to take photos of you. And that's what we did for 100 members. It's like, come in. It was like school picture day. And, you know, and then we gave them the digital copies of those headshots so they could put it on their LinkedIn profile. It was like, to me, that was like such an easy thing to do and such an obvious, but it was a barrier. And I was like, how do we take down barriers? How do we make it really, really easy? And for me, that was like a no-brainer investment to do for all the members and the organization.
Yeah,
so,
you didn't have to think about it. You're right. We should have a whole other conversation about the power of formats. But the key thing, a format is a kind of algorithm. And especially when you're dealing with humans in a process like this, it's a kind of social algorithm. And so we should make that link for people as well, that what you're looking for is, yes, there's huge power in formats, but there's even more power in knowing which of those social algorithms really work for what kind of processes and challenges and so on. I'm not going to let you shrug it off here. There is also just your amazing leadership talent where powerful people come into your orbit and just want to make you happy because they have a sense of this woman knows how to get stuff done and knows how to make the world a better place. And so
I'm still working on you.
Yes, I think I'm your problem child, actually. I think that's why we're still here. But,
the work isn't done yet.
Yes, exactly.
But if we look back on like this positive peace lens, right? Because how do you make peace practical? For Hispanic Net, it was how my challenge was, how do I help move this community forward, right? And so one is, how do I increase their ability to participate and to be incorporated in the entrepreneurship ecosystem, right? And it could be tiny things like, you need to have a LinkedIn profile, you need to have a headshot, you need to know how to pitch. Those things are all learnable and trainable. They're behaviors that you can do. And when you put those tools, those behavior training into a community, into an ecosystem, it increases their ability to participate, innovate, and get their ideas out there, right? And to me, when I think about peace, it is about how do we get to realize our talents, and how do we get to create, and how can we do things that are positive and generative. And it might be a big positive peace thing for me today is I would love to support entrepreneurs who would start companies that would hire lots of people who could earn a solid middle-class income. Economic impact, social impact, it increases people's ability to take care of their families and the people that they love. So I'm going to close here